being Tradwife to a boss babe? And is there a middle?
I'm sure everyone's gonna have a hard time guessing what my position is. I do think that the boss babe stuff is way overdone. I think it's a bad choice for most women, and I do think motherhood should be the primary goal. But there's a couple of things I should say about that. The first is, you and I and everybody else on this panel, we were all born into a world where, by the 70s, we had huge numbers of women in the workforce. It completely changed the economy. It completely changed from like a family wage to an individual wage. So now we're all like I was when I had my first daughter. I was like, well, shit, how do you do this on one income, right? It's very tricky. It's hard to do now. And I do understand that. I have a lot of sympathy for that. I totally get it. But I think there's a silver lining with the internet and with a lot of remote work. I think like 40% of all work in North America is going to be remote by 2030 or something like that.
Praise,
it's a
baby
lot.
Jesus.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of ways now that you can earn a little money, have a little side hustle while you're at home with your kids. But what always gets lost, and who was speaking earlier, Natalia. When I was listening to Natalia, there's always this focus on the woman, and it's like, but what about her? And she needs to be happy, and she shouldn't have to sacrifice. And I think that that's the wrong way to think about it. I'm over here going, what about the kids? If you're going to bring kids into the world, the kids need to be the primary focus. You can be happy without having a career, and life is long. So it's not that you have to stay home with kids until you're 70, right? I'm 44 and most of my kids are grown up and moved out now. So that's why I can be here doing things like this with you guys now. I put in the family work on the front end, and now I can do a few other things with my time. So I don't want to take up too much more time. That's kind of where I'm coming from with it.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. I think looking as a whole approach, a holistic approach to the family is a good way to guise it. Nova Star, to you.
Hey. Considering I've kind of done both, my admonishment to women and young women all over the place would be this: it's never going to be 100%. They try to sell you on just being a mother, and that will satisfy you. And then a lot of mothers, their children start getting older, and then the next thing you know, the women are sitting around going, I feel incomplete. And then on the other side, the women who are working all the time, they have the gripe about not having a family. You're in a catch-22. So you got to pick and choose what your vices are going to be.
Yeah,
that's what I would say on that.
That's fair. Yeah, and I think everybody essentially has to pick and choose at the end of the day. Kat, to you, what do you think?
I just think life isn't about being happy. It's about having a purpose, and your purpose should be something greater than you. So if you choose to have a family, it should be your legacy. If you choose not to have a family, then it should be whatever that is. But I don't think you can do both well. You can do both really poorly. And if you're going to have a family, that should always be the priority, because kids are more important than any amount of money in the world. Because if your kid was sick one day, you'd throw all of it in the trash for your kid, and you can't get those years back. And that relationship is the most important relationship next to your spouse or your significant other. There's nothing else that's more important. There's women don't really care about that stuff. Once you reach a certain age, you're just like, I don't really care what I did for a living. I'm not going to be thinking about that on my deathbed. I'm going to be thinking about people. Women are social creatures. We like our families, extended families. We like having community. We don't really care about all that other superficial stuff.
That's fair. Torsha, to you.
I don't know. It's very interesting to hear everybody's input. I feel like I want a house husband. I want to work. I think men should be in the home. I don't know. But
lock it up in the basement.
Not
tracking device.
Yeah. I'm psycho though, so I need more therapy before I can even think that far. But sometimes when I hear people say they want to be a boss bitch, I feel like they ignore the kids. I actually take a different approach. I feel like everybody's kids are my kids, because I don't plan on having any of them, but
I'm sending mine to you.
I'll take them.
Take them for a week. Give me a week off.
Yeah, so I try to be mindful and stuff. I'm not just going to promote crazy behavior and shit. But yeah, I want a house husband, you know.
That's
pretty
fair.
much it.
That's fair. That's completely the totally opposite direction. I like it because I've
There
heard a
is.
little bit of everything so far, and Neve definitely not
I had the
least.
house husband.
I just wanted to say, I wanted to welcome Nat to the platform. I think we've brushed shoulders once or twice, and I've definitely subscribed, so happy to have you. I think that economy exists for a reason, and without caricaturing both sides to the situation or the circumstance, I think a lot of women in life are forced to be both at different times in their life, especially from an economic perspective. It can be really difficult to save up for a down payment or to actually fund a house long term initially, and so I think a lot of women are forced into that boss babe role within the first like maybe in their 20s, working into their 30s. But I also see a lot of women that are embrace that tradwife kind of mentality. When a lot of those economic goals have been met, and they can kind of sit down and focus on more of like the family aspect. So I think extremes when you're forced into either one, though, I've also seen that as well. I have very successful women that I know that struggle with more of the creating that family, and women who have established family who maybe kind of are struggling with the content element to that. So yeah, that's my thought on that.
That's good. I like it. So based on that, where would we say the push is coming from? Because women didn't just wake up yesterday and start trying to force themselves into college, go get a career, do all these things, and simultaneously try to be a wife too. Like, I felt like this push kind of came through between 1990, 2000, especially. Why do we feel the need to be boss babes regardless?
Well, I did write a book about this, if anybody's interested.
What's your book called? What's the title of your book?
It's Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation, and it kind of goes over the whole genesis of women's liberation movements, where they came from, where the ideas came from, who funded these things. Because, like Sarah said, this is new. At the time that the suffragettes were, pushing for women's right to vote, it was extremely unpopular. In fact, it was so unpopular that in referendums, where states had a referendum where they let women vote on whether they even wanted the right to vote on the ballot, like in the state of Massachusetts, for example, there was like 4% of women who bothered to show up that wanted suffrage. There was way bigger membership in anti-suffrage groups among women than there was in pro-suffrage.
Why? Why didn't they just want, why the fight? Why was it such a bad thing just to have the option? It's like, you don't have to vote, but at least I would want the choice, maybe.
Well, it's really interesting if you go back and read some of the pamphlets and the tracts or some of the written debates that anti-suffragists had with suffragists back then publicly. They had really good reasons for this that now, with 100 years of hindsight, I look back and read what they said and I'm like, damn, they were right. Like, they really saw what was coming down the pipe if you start with suffrage and where that was going to lead. So they would say things like, why are you tasking women with things they cannot do? For example, if you give women the right to vote and they become equal civic actors in politics, why would they not be drafted like men are? This is something that you see on podcasts now being talked about, right? People bring up this argument of how come women can vote to send men to war, but they can't be drafted, things like that. They said, we don't see how a husband and wife voting against each other is not going to split the household and cause problems and cause marital discord when you have women and their groups that are lobbying for women's rights, and then you have men who've always been in politics and running things. How are those things not going to conflict? How is that not going to cause women and men to feel pitted against each other? They also said, we don't want to have to do stuff like jury duty. We don't want to be dragged into the dirty business of political life, because politics is kind of a dirty business. It was back then and it still is now. You have to be pretty ruthless. And women were very, Susan B. Anthony herself, this is probably the best answer to your question, and then I'll shut up. Susan B. Anthony, in her own History of Women's Suffrage, said herself that women were the single biggest roadblock to women's suffrage. And the reason was because at this time, which she was writing this in, I think, 1895, women already had everything they wanted. They already could get into college. That a lot of these things are myths. People have this idea that women couldn't leave the house before 1920. It's total bullshit. They've had higher high school graduation rates, higher literacy rates since we started tracking those numbers in 1790. They were able to get into most colleges and universities with the exception of a few like Ivy League programs that women weren't allowed. But they were allowed to work outside the house. They could own property. They could do all kinds of things. And the things they couldn't do oftentimes were misrepresented, right? So like you'll hear people say, oh, women couldn't have a credit card. Well, do you know why? The reason women couldn't have a credit card is because they couldn't be held legally liable for debt and supporting the family. So if your kids ended up in the poorhouse, the man would get in trouble. Right? So, yeah.
The debt actually went to the husband. So, like, yeah, that doesn't sound all that bad. But
so, and there were like in the state of New York, if you were a wealthy woman who came into a marriage with an inheritance and a lot of property, and you married a poor man, if you divorced him, which was harder to do, you had to show cause to get a divorce. But let's say you could prove he was cheating, maybe he fathered a child with another woman or something, and you were granted a divorce, he had no right to any of your money, but he still had to legally support you. So this idea that women were like horribly oppressed and the deck was stacked against them is just not historically accurate. So a lot of women said, look, we don't want to give up the privileges and protections that we have under male suffrage. And if you make us equal with men, we're going to be expected to support the family, go to war, participate in, dirty politics, show up for jury duty. We're going to have to do both what we do now as women and what men do, and we don't want all that. Like we want to focus on our own sphere where we already have a lot of power and influence. It was basically the reason.
I would rather garden and color and paint and bake cookies and have like sometimes I sit and think about it. I'm like, damn, if I didn't have to work 8 hours a day, think of all the other things I could actually get done. It would be so nice. But and I will say when I did have that luxury, it was very nice, like being able to just be a stay-at-home mom and wife and like, I'd call my husband. I'm like, I want to paint a room. And he'd be like, all right, paint a room. And I could do it, because I had the time and care to do it. But I think that, I think that, women, I'm wondering, do we believe that maybe women are starting to question some of this now and say like, wait a minute, like this wasn't our choice, like we didn't ask for all of this? Or do we think that it's kind of splitting down the middle and it is going a hard line between, as Natalia said, Natty, I keep getting the Natty and Natalia. As Natty was saying earlier, it's like there's a Tradwife and there's a Bossbabe and they're trending. Right? It's a trend to do one or the other. So you're socially influenced to believe that you have to be one or the other or figure it out some way. Do you think that people are just kind of being forced into those roles and feel like they can't choose?
I don't think necessarily, like going back to your initial question, what got us into this kind of like mindset, I can tell you. My grandmother is 109 years old. She lived through a time where, like the rights were not there. We can say that those are myths. But I know she didn't have a choice. She didn't have a choice whether to leave my grandfather. She didn't have a choice whether to go out and work. There were times where like my grandfather did not give money to my family and they were starving. And like as kids, they were forced to work. So like she really made sure and made a point to raise her daughters with the mentality that they had to work, that they had to be successful, because like not having a choice and not having the opportunities that I can with today. She lived through that. She lived through like.
I just want to clarify.
Sorry, Rachel. Can you please let me speak? She lived through that traditional where like as a woman she had no rights. If you went to the police because your husband was abusing you, and that's often happened, like
was she in America though?
There were times where she lived in America for a time. She lived in America during the 40s. Mm-hmm. So she experienced those situations. And of course, like the situation in America, it's different to the situation in Colombia. But according from what she told me about the times that she lived in America,